Welcome to Nightmares Incorporated, where our goal is to make your sleep anything but restful. So sit back, relax, and enjoy part 2 of Beyond the Veil. "1:25 a.m. Carl Yeager was a diligent and personable insurance salesman, easily recognized by his crisp attire and easygoing smile. Well respected in the community, Carl is admired not only for his professionalism, but also for his generous spirit. He's a regular contributor to local charities, supporting initiatives ranging from food banks to youth programs. Neighbors often notice his presence at community fundraisers and charity auctions, where his warmth and commitment shine. Outside of his career and volunteer work, Carl is a devoted mini-golf enthusiast. Whether perfecting his putting technique or joining weekend tournaments at the local course, he delights in both the friendly competition and the camaraderie that the sport brings. It is not uncommon to spot him coaching young players, sharing strategies with a patient hand and a wry sense of humor. A believer in balance and well-being, Carl maintains a steady exercise routine, hitting the gym 3 times a week, no matter how busy his schedule becomes. This dedication to fitness is matched by his love for the outdoors. He can often be found jogging through the park at sunrise or cycling along the river trails. Through his actions and everyday choices, Carl has always demonstrated a thoughtful, disciplined approach to life, all while remaining approachable and good-natured to those around him. All of that was true until 9:12 p.m. on June 27th. When a bright flash of light that was a shade of blue that he had never seen before knocked him out of his life as clean as wind blowing out a lit match, destroying the life force that animated his body, leaving only a shell for something else to call its home. The thing that crawls through a window that sits open to combat the summer heat on Mere Avenue vaguely resembles the man who once inhabited this vessel. His body has undergone some alterations, every part of it being twisted and reforged to serve one purpose: to feed. His once lean and tanned frame is now something different altogether, and he moves with an alien, segmented grace. Elongated and impossibly flexible, glistening faintly beneath the strange starlight coming through the opened window, each vertebra has unfurled into a series of overlapping chitinous plates that ripple from neck to heel. Limbs have multiplied. Instead of 2 arms and 2 legs, a multitude of thin, articulated appendages sprout from his sides, ribs having been repurposed, jointed and tapering, ending in hooked, dexterous claws that scrabble silently against the floorboards. His skin, mottled and pale, bears the sheen and subtle ridging of an exoskeleton, while what was once his back now arches higher with each undulating movement, allowing him to slither and scuttle with unnatural speed. The face, still a wet echo of Carl's former self, shows vestigial traces of a smile, warped by the intrusion of those massive mandibles, glistening with saliva, which part and click with feverish anticipation. Eyelids have receded, leaving wide, lidless orbs that catch the light with a cold, compound shimmer. Where once there were worries about mortgage payments, anticipation for the game on Sunday morning, love for community and friends, there now only burns one imperative: meat. That's what brought the thing that was once Carl Yeager into this structure that it no longer fully recognizes. There's a scent, unfamiliar, but the same deep down. Meat. The creature silently glides through the kitchen, a horror that stretches the length of 6 feet and runs low to the ground, driven forward by the scent of meat. Up the stairs, going into a small room where the meat smell is faint but still delicious all the same. The other smells, though, cloying, acidic, smells of ammonia, cause the creature to back out of the small room, its senses offended. But the meat smell is close. Down the hall, slipping through the cracked open door, the smell of meat growing stronger. Not one, but 2, gliding across the floor of the room as silent as death itself. The creature scuttles underneath the bed. Emerging from the other side, it uses the last foot of its body and the strong legs that sprout from where Carl's calves used to be to grip the underside of the bed, anchoring itself. The 5 feet of abominable horror that is its upper body falls upon the 2 sleeping figures in the bed. There are screams. Oh yes, there are screams. But then there is a flash of red, the crunch of bones, and then meat. 1:30 a.m. The house at the end of Barlow Lane was steeped in darkness, as the sudden blackout had left no home or structure built by human hands untouched. Bob Arliss, grumbling under his breath, fumbled for his slippers. It wasn't the first time the breaker had tripped. His bungalow was as tired as he was, wires older than most of the cars he fixed. He padded down the hallway, one hand on the wall to guide him, the other clutching a flashlight whose batteries had seen better decades. The kitchen was a study in shadow, the refrigerator dark, the sound of the branches from the dead tree he kept meaning to cut down scraping against the window above the kitchen sink, seeming louder than normal with the usual hum of the kitchen silenced. Bob's eyes adjusted, picking out the familiar shapes: table, counter, his father's battered toolbox on the chair where he'd left it. At the basement door, he hesitated. The air was tinged with something sharp, acrid. Bob wrinkled his nose. Maybe a dead mouse. He'd found his fair share, and worse, over the years. Still, it rankled, setting his teeth on edge. He muttered a curse and descended the stairs. At the bottom landing, the world seemed to be constricted. Bob's flashlight flickered, a weak cone of yellow. He swept it across the cinder block walls, the tangle of old pipes, the ancient fuse box. Something moved. Swift, almost liquid, a blur at the edges of the light. Bob's heart stuttered. He blinked, trying to clear the haze from his vision. He swept the room again until he settled on a corner at the far end. It was there. A figure hunched in the corner. Too thin. Limbs wrong. Elongated. The head, oh Christ, the head seemed almost human. But the eyes shimmered glassy and black, and the long needled proboscis twitched, questing at the air. Bob froze. His mind scrambled, searching for sense, for anything that belonged to the world he knew. The creature crawled forward, joints bending backwards, a grotesque parody of a person. It was dressed in tatters that might once have been clothing. Its skin was gray, mottled with shadows, and the stench, sweet, rotting, chemical, clung to every breath. "What the fuck?" Bob whispered, voice shaking. He fumbled for a wrench on the workbench, cold metal slick in his hand. The creature regarded him, head cocked, and for a moment Bob thought he saw something someone behind those eyes. But then the mouth parts flexed, glistening, and the creature lunged. Closing the distance between them in seconds, Bob swung with the wrench, but there never really was a chance. His blow bounced off the carapace of the creature's side, and when the proboscis, a tube perhaps 3 inches in diameter, pierced through his sternum and into his chest, only a whoosh of air escaped his mouth rather than a scream. The wrench clattered uselessly on the floor as the sucking sounds of the creature who had once been one of his neighbors filled the darkened basement. As the proboscis drained blood, it also secreted a fluid that liquefied the organs and muscle of its prey. Fortunately for Bob Arliss, the initial shock of his sternum being broken and the destruction of the heart that lay behind it brought about unconsciousness and then death rather quickly. He did not feel his organs melting into a fluid and then being forcibly pulled out as the creature fed. By the time it was finished, the thing that had once been a man discarded the empty sack of skin and bones that had once been Bob Arliss. 1:35 a.m. Denise's eyes snapped open to the cold humming silence of the library lobby. For several seconds her mind floated in formless confusion. Memory and sensation adrift like leaves in a black current. The lights overhead were out, replaced by a strange blue light that seemed to have no clear origin, shifting in hues that were unfamiliar to her mind. The vast desk and the neat ranks of book returns that were as known to her as her own living room were gone, replaced by bulges and humps that were alien. She was lying on what was left of the faded rug, cheek pressed to the rough weave, and her body ached as if she had run a marathon in her sleep. Anthony, Michael, fear, rescue, running? Fragments. Anthony's hand tight around her wrist, Michael's desperate voice, a smell like burning copper, rippled through her, but none of it made sense, as if she'd awakened from a dream that had been happening to someone else. She pushed herself upright, every muscle trembling, palms stinging from contact with the cold floor. The library was empty, but didn't feel abandoned. A sense of recent violence clung to the air, as tangible as the residue of smoke. She staggered to her feet, blinking away the last shadows of unconsciousness. The massive front doors loomed ahead, latticed with Art Deco glass panes and iron fretwork. Denise's steps were uneven, but she crossed the lobby, drawn to the doors by the prickling certainty that something was terribly wrong. She stopped short, heart pounding. The front doors were sealed shut, the strange light brightening as she approached as if to mock her. A thick, pulsing layer of something organic had crept over the glass and iron, veining itself into ropes of pale, glistening tissue. At first, Denise thought it might be a strange trick of the alien light, but then the mass seemed to quiver in response to her approach, as if it could sense her, like a sea anemone recoiling from a shadow. She reached out, drawn by morbid curiosity, and the substance retracted slightly, revealing only more layers beneath. She jerked her hand back, bile rising in her throat. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but it was a hollow, slow-spreading sensation, as if her own emotions had to wade through syrup. Every instinct screamed at her to escape, but there was no apparent exit. The windows along the lobby were opaque with the same strange growth, their frames bulging and warped. For a moment, Denise stood paralyzed, heart hammering against the inside of her ribs. Everywhere she looked, the library was mutated, the familiar geometry of walls and shelves subtly warped, as if the building itself were breathing, exhaling a chill that brushed against her skin in shivering waves. The air was thick, electric, tinged with the smell of ozone and something rank, like fresh earth from a grave. She forced herself to move, each step a wrenching act of will. Her footsteps sounded hollow, out of sync with the rhythm of her own pulse. The stacks, once neat and reassuring, were now a maze of shifting shadows and half-seen corridors, their boundaries wavering at the edge of her vision. As she passed between them, Denise became aware of shapes drifting through the gloom, tall and loping, some hunched and shuddering, others gliding with impossible grace. They hovered at the periphery, so faint they seemed to be nothing more than tricks of the constantly shifting light. Yet when she tried to focus, their outlines sharpened for a heartbeat, and her blood ran cold. They were nearly translucent, flickering in and out of existence like images on a faulty screen. Some had faces, blank, featureless ovals stretched too long to belong to anything human. Others seemed draped in vaporous rags or tethered to the broken shelves by sinews of mist. They moved without sound, their motions eerily synchronized as if they obeyed a logic she couldn't see. As Denise kept walking, the sensation deepened. She was glimpsing things that weren't really there, yet at the same time, they were. It was like looking at a double-exposed piece of film, only she got the sense that she was seeing something older than what she knew, older than memory itself. And with every blink, she felt less certain again. The line between what was real and what merely pressed against the inside of her mind grew thin and indistinct. Once a shape drifted close enough that she caught the faintest brush of icy air against her cheek, and she recoiled, her breath fogging before her lips. She moved deeper into the twisted interior, compelled and repelled in equal measures. The architecture grew stranger. Corridors spiraled where there had once been none. Doorways stood open to rooms she'd never seen in all her years in the library. The lights flickered faster, casting strobe-like shadows that made the shapes jitter and jerk, as though they were struggling to break free of whatever boundary held them. At the heart of it all, Denise sensed a presence, vast, watching, and hungry. Its awareness brushing against hers like the edge of a nightmare that she could not wake from. She staggered on, her thoughts unraveling, desperate for a way out, even as the sense of enclosure pressed tighter. And with every faltering step, the conviction grew that she was not merely seeing these things, she was being seen in return. 1:48 a.m. Sheriff Froman eased his cruiser to a stop at the emergency access ramp of the hospital parking lot, the headlights carving a brief path through the thick, unyielding darkness. After a moment of hesitation, he exited his vehicle, leaving the door open behind him for a reason that was not quite clear within his mind. "Always make sure you have an exit plan." A voice floated up from the depths of his consciousness. Whose voice was it? Was it his? No. It sounded like Brewster, the humorless drill sergeant who had taken the 18-year-old kid that Froman had been and turned him into a soldier. "Not that I got a lot to work with," Brewster had said upon the first day of basic training. "If this is the best that the hills of West Virginia have to offer the United States military, then you should have just stayed at home plucking your banjo, boy." When David had reminded the squat but thickly built sergeant that he was in fact from Virginia and not West Virginia, the sergeant had complimented him on his knowledge of geography, and then ordered him to demonstrate his math skills by dropping and giving the sergeant 50 push-ups, followed by a few laps ran around the base. Brewster had been barking at him the whole time. "You're from where I say you're from till you've earned the right for me to remember your fucking name. Now do you understand me, Banjo Boy?" "Yes, sir," David had replied each time. "Always keep an exit open," the voice spoke again. "When entering hostile territory in an unknown situation, always keep an exit open at your back. Beating a retreat ain't cowardice, you banjo-plucking hillbilly. It's always better to pull back, regroup, and try a different angle, rather than die trying to force a losing situation. Although I expect you won't even make it off the plane once you're over there. Nah, I expect you'll be crying for your mama's moonshine before that bird even lands. Won't you, West Virginia?" And while David had missed his mother the entire time he was gone, he had in fact made it off the plane. His reward for doing so had been 4 years in hell. Why was he thinking about Brewster? About anything from that time? "Because this is a war zone," his mind whispered. "And you know it. You can feel it. You might not know who the enemy is, but you know that there is one." The parking lot stretched out behind him, eerie and devoid of sound. Without the usual halo of lampposts, the hospital itself became a hulking shadow, its windows blank and black, the familiar red emergency sign extinguished. He listened, waiting for the shudder of an automatic door, the click of a cigarette lighter from a nurse on a break, any scrap of routine life. Instead, the night pressed in tightly. Even the crickets seemed to have retreated, leaving the air so silent that the faint ticking of the cruiser's engine echoed. Froman squinted, trying to pierce the gloom. Not a single figure crossed the lot. No clusters of anxious visitors, no ambulances idling, no wheelchairs left at the curb. He clicked on his flashlight and stepped out, boots crunching grit, the beam slicing through the void. The automatic doors ahead were stilled, glass smeared with mist, their motionless panes warning of the blackout's reach. He scanned the horizon, storefronts, street corners, distant homes, all swallowed by the same thick veil. Not a glimmer of life. How far did this blackout stretch? Was the whole of Haven, Virginia, in the dark? He checked the radio at his belt, its silence a weight in his palm, and let his other hand rest on his sidearm, his pulse a steady thrum in his wrist. The only sounds as he moved toward the emergency entrance were the hollow echo of his own footsteps, and the low, restless murmur of the wind rustling through empty branches. Each step in the darkness made him more alert, heart thrumming with the certainty that something was here. Something was waiting just beyond the reach of his light. Sheriff Froman's flashlight picked out the faint outline of the door leading to the emergency access ramp. Opening it hesitantly, he stepped through. Water beaded on the metal handrails, slick with condensation. Each step downward was accompanied by the slow squeal of his boots on wet concrete. He briefly wondered where this moisture had come from, as it had not rained in at least a few days and the air was not humid. At the ramp's foot, the basement entrance yawned open, its battered double doors wedged by a cinder block that the deputies bringing the bodies in from their sweep must have used for convenience. Darkness pooled within so thick that the generous beam of his maglite flattened and dissolved at the edges. He paused at the threshold, counting his breaths. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint drip of water somewhere in the gloom. The air was cooler inside, and dense with the scent of chemical cleaners and something underneath. Rot, old blood, the peculiar sweetness that clings to places of death. The narrow corridor led him to a battered sign, Morgue, its painted letters chipped and peeling, flecks of rust spattering the surface. The walls here were tiled, the grout darkened by years of use, and the floor was sticky underfoot. Inside, the cold thickened, biting through his uniform. The flashlight circle swept the room, revealing vinyl body bags stacked haphazardly along one wall, their outlines slack and shrunken, pale tags fluttering like flags at their zippers. Every one of the body bags had been torn open from the inside, the ragged holes gaping, echoing the ones he'd seen at the mortuary earlier, a grim symmetry he couldn't ignore. He angled his light downward, catching partial footprints, smears of something dark, leading off in all directions, out the door he had just come through, towards the stairs leading into the hospital's main level, and some going deeper into the basement. His heart thudded against his vest as he took another step, the sound echoing in the close, windowless space. Glancing up, he saw the outline of a gurney tipped on its side, sheets tangled and stained, drawers gaped open along the far wall, the interiors empty but stained at the seams. A single latex glove lay discarded at his feet, fingers curled inward like a dying spider. He crept forward, tension thrumming in his veins, each step carrying him deeper into the oppressive gloom. Past the upended gurney, the darkness thickened, swallowing the beam of his flashlight until it seemed only a feeble glow fighting against the void. A few steps farther in, and he first saw the bodies. 4 forms were sprawled in grotesque disarray, the familiar uniforms of his deputies twisted and bloodied, badges catching the light like warning eyes. Limbs jutted at unnatural angles, faces waxy and blank, eyes glassy with the final terror they had witnessed. They were men and women he had grown to think of as brothers and sisters, even surrogate sons and daughters, in some cases. And now here they lay, looking the same as Donner had at the mortuary, as if they had been mauled by bears or hyenas. David reversed his grip on the maglite and drew his sidearm, laying his right wrist over his left and preparing to continue onward. A cold ache began spreading beneath his ribs. In the silence that pressed in from all sides, his heartbeat sounded impossibly loud. Then, slicing through the hush, David heard a voice. A thin, desperate thread from farther down the hall, just beyond the next corner. It was more a rasp than a call, as if forced through shattered teeth. "Please, help me." He froze, every instinct alight with warning. Still, unable to turn away, he tightened his grip on the flashlight and edged past the fallen deputies, careful not to disturb their twisted forms. The voice came again, raw and pleading. "Please, someone. Oh, God. Please, help." Taking a deep breath in an attempt to steady himself, David stepped as quietly as he could around the next corner. The sight that greeted him was nothing short of pure madness. The first thing he saw was the deputy. At a glance, he was pretty sure that it was Rollins, being held aloft in the air by something that should not exist. The thing stood roughly the same height as an average-sized man, but was far broader across the middle, David assumed that this increased width was required to accommodate the large mouth that began just below where the creature's nose should be and ended right around where one would normally find a belly button. What appeared to be broken ribs formed jagged teeth, although there were far too many. A gaping red hole oozing a strange black fluid lay beyond those malformed teeth, a hole that Rollins' leg was disappearing into bit by bit, as if the thing were attempting to swallow him whole. Bony protuberances stuck out of the thing's sides, seeming to serve as makeshift limbs formed from segmented bone. These limbs had punctured Rollins' sides, along with one of his legs, and were holding the 218-pound man in the air as if he weighed nothing. The side of the deputy's face that David could see looked like raw hamburger. The eye on the left side popped and was lying on the ruined cheek in a formless mass. Soft chewing sounds could be heard over the deputy's weakening cries for help. It was these sounds that spurred David into action. Utter revulsion filled him at the thought of this man being eaten alive by this thing.
"Help me, please, help,"
came the last quiet pleas for help, and then mercifully, Deputy Hank Rollins either passed out from shock or died from blood loss. The quiet chewing was the only sound within the basement for the next few moments, but then it was drowned out by the roar of gunfire. 5 of the 6 rounds from Sheriff Froman's .357 struck the creature, the first shot going wild as David was trying to avoid hitting Rollins, whether the man was dead or alive. The lumpy mass that might have served as the creature's head turned to face the sheriff, eyes that were nothing more than slits locking with his. The odd limbs that had pierced Rollins' body withdrew, dropping the man's mangled form to the floor with a wet thump, and began advancing towards David. Getting a full view of the creature provided more detail than David's mind wanted as he began walking backwards and reaching for his speed loader. The creature was a grotesque fusion of nightmare and anatomy gone awry. Its head was not distinct, but instead appeared as a lumpen, malformed mass perched atop its hunched shoulders, giving the unsettling impression that its face might be anywhere, or nowhere at all. Instead of recognizable features, the head is little more than a bulge, its surface uneven and shifting, with slits that suggest eyes peering from the folds. Its skin is stretched and leathery, the color reminiscent of old parchment left to dry in the sun, mottled with bruised purples, yellows, and sickly grays. The skin appears almost armor-like in its resilience, but is cracked and pulled tight across its frame, hinting at the unnatural strength of the being. The bony limbs probe the air endlessly and senselessly, reaching out towards the ceiling, the walls, the sheriff, causing David to wonder if perhaps its eyesight was impaired. The mouth is a gaping maw, blood-flecked, jagged teeth, and a long, obscene tongue. An odd mewling noise came from the horror as it advanced towards the retreating sheriff. Having reloaded, David raised his sidearm and opened fire again, this time squeezing off all 6 rounds and aiming for center mass. All 6 struck home, breaking a couple of the creature's teeth, one tearing into the soft tissue of its mouth, the other 2 rounds striking the left side of what could be considered its chest. But still, the horror kept advancing. Opening the cylinder again, David quickly reloaded his weapon with the last of his ammunition. Again, he squeezed off all 6 rounds. 5 of them found their mark. The 3rd shot went wild as David nearly tripped over the legs of one of the mangled deputies. but the barrage finally took its toll. As David's gun struck dry, the creature faltered, shuddering as if uncertain whether to advance or retreat. For a moment it loomed in the flickering shadows, its grotesque form wavering beneath the harsh beam of the flashlight. Then a tremor ran through its body. It took an ungainly step backwards, its bony limbs scraping across the stained linoleum. With a guttural hiss, chillingly human in its timbre, it collapsed forward, folding those unnatural appendages beneath its torso. Now hunched low, the creature propelled itself in a crab-like scuttle, the twisted limbs acting as makeshift legs. It kept its faceless bulge turned toward David, slits glinting with something otherworldly. Another hiss issued, this one straining with malice and something that sounded uncannily like a plea. Before David could tell if he had injured the thing or merely confused it, the creature retreated, scrabbling backwards at spine-crawling speed, vanishing into the darkness that yawned at the far end of the hospital's basement. The echo of its passage lingered, half animal, half desperate warning, leaving David alone but for the silence and the bodies of his fallen comrades. David let out a shaky breath, his heart hammering so hard inside of his chest that it hurt. I shot that motherfucker at least 15 times. His mind yammered. How is it not dead? What the hell even is it? But Sheriff Froman thought he knew part of the answer to his second question, just as he thought he knew why the hospital had been so quiet when he approached, why there hadn't been any orderlies, nurses, visitors, or even patients standing outside when he had arrived, and why he had not encountered any other horrors as he had made his way through the darkened basement. How many dead in the main building? He asked himself, and the answer came to him at once. All of them. Or at least those who couldn't hide or get out when everything happened. He looked back down at the mangled bodies of the deputies, his men and women, and he thought about the one in the room further beyond. A pang of grief cut through Sheriff Froman, sharp as the cold metal of his badge. Deputy Rollins. The old bastard had joined the department alongside him, back when the nights were quieter and the worst thing anyone faced was a bar fight or a busted taillight. Rollins could have worn the star, could have run the whole outfit if he'd wanted to, and everyone knew it. But he'd shrugged off the office with a wry grin, content to let Froman take the heat and the late-night calls, commenting to him once, "Hell, Dave, if the shit ever hits the fan, I'd feel better following a soldier into battle." But when the battle finally came, David had not been here. It didn't matter to him that his presence likely would not have changed anything. He felt he had failed them. He had failed Rollins and their families. And now he would have to leave them behind for the time being, as he had no way of knowing where that thing had gone, or how many others might be hiding within the shadows. "But you know how many of them there are in total, don't you, good buddy?" David's mind spoke. And yes, he did. "I'll come back for you, Hank," David said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "I'll come back for all of you." Reluctantly, David turned away, forcing himself to move, each step feeling like a betrayal. He kept his shoulders squared, jaw set, and retraced his path through the wounded corridors of the basement, the hush broken only by the echo of his boots on blood-slick linoleum. He holstered his weapon as he did so, seeing as it was little more than a club without ammunition. He was nearly to the ramp, the faint cold light from the headlights of his cruiser filtering in from outside, a promise of escape, when a sound cracked through the stillness. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Sharp and arrhythmic, echoing like hailstones against a window pane. He felt, before he saw, that crawling dread, a certainty that the thing had returned. David spun, maglite trembling in his grip, and the beam sliced through the shadows. Out from the ruined gloom at the far end of the hallway, something moved, quick and precise, legs clicking against the floor, glossy and white, impossibly jointed. The creature burst into the circle of light, its body and angles all wrong, all hunger, all hate. There was no time to think. Instinct roared through him. He pivoted, heart jackhammering, and sprinted for the ramp. The cold night suddenly not nearly cold enough for the terror pounding through his blood. Behind him, the tapping accelerated, a staccato death march closing in. Sheriff Froman ran like he had not run in years, pouring it on as heavy as he could. Yet still he could sense that the thing was closing on him. As he reached the ramp, he could see red and blue lights bouncing off the walls of the access area. His radio coming to life confirmed what his eyes had already told him.
"Sheriff, we're at the hospital,"
Hernandez's voice said.
"I'm standing by your cruiser. Where are you?"
Pulling his radio from his belt without missing a step, David depressed the talk button. "Hernandez, I'm coming up the access ramp with the heat coming right behind me," he said, his voice clear and concise despite his hammering heart and confused mind. "When I get clear, I need you and whoever is out there with you to open fire, regardless of what you see coming out of this fucking basement behind me. I repeat, open fire once I'm clear. That's an order." "Copy," was the deputy's only reply. David put what little he had left into his run, pushing his body as hard as he could. He could hear the tapping of those horrific legs getting louder, and could sense that the creature was nearly within striking distance. Busting through the doorway at the top of the access ramp, Sheriff Froman felt the cold night slap against his face, a sensation sharper than adrenaline itself. The parking lot was a blur of siren-lit chaos, with officers standing behind their cruisers, their weapons raised. Without slowing, he pivoted hard to the right, boots scraping on the concrete, and hurled himself down, rolling beneath the sweep of headlights. "Get ready!" David bellowed. "And don't stop till that fucking thing stops moving. It killed 5 of your brothers and sisters." He didn't know if the thing that had killed Rollins had been responsible for the others, but in the moment it didn't matter. It also didn't matter that he had no rational explanation of how something like the horror that he had encountered could exist, and that the only reason he wasn't lying in the fetal position drooling on the ground is because the situation had developed too fast. All Sheriff David Froman knew was that he wanted that fucking thing dead. A split second later, the basement door shuddered as the creature shot through the opening with a hideous clatter, all jagged limbs and impossible speed. The deputies, eyes wild with terror but hands steady, unleashed a barrage of gunfire, muzzle flashes strobing in the swirling red and blue, the sound shattering the relative quiet of the night air. David pressed himself flat to the asphalt, heart thundering in his ears, every muscle tensed in anticipation of a screech, a scream, or the sickening sound of bullets meeting flesh or chitin. He began to crawl, low to the ground, pulling himself along with his forearms, getting clear of the battle, as at the moment he was about as useful as a 36-hour clock. After moving away from the immediate danger, David lay on his back, chest heaving as he dragged in cold, metallic-tasting breaths. The world around him was a chaos of staccato bursts of violence, the sound of gunfire, and the acrid scent of gunpowder mixed with a deep, earthy rot that seemed to emanate from the creature itself. He blinked sweat and grit out of his eyes as intermittent bursts of light, red, blue, white-hot muzzle flashes, carved wild shadows across the parking lot, briefly illuminating the monstrous silhouette at the center of it all. Gradually, the haze receded from David's vision. The chaotic dance of light steadied, the ringing in his ears faded, and through the haze of cordite and terror, he saw the impossible. The thing was down. Its grotesque frame, all angles and distorted flesh, jerked and spasmed on the unforgiving asphalt, riddled by the deputy's relentless hail. Chunks of leathery flesh were shattered, torn away to reveal something viscous and dark beneath. Several of the bone legs had been broken, all oozing a reddish-black fluid. The air thrummed with the residual energy of violence, but the creature itself had fallen. 2 more shotgun blasts from one of the deputies, David thought it was Hernandez, and the misshapen, lumpy mass that David took to be the creature's head disappeared in a reddish-black mist. And then it lay still. "You gonna get up, or you gonna lie there on your ass, West Virginia?" Brewster's voice again, coming into Sheriff Froman's mind as clearly as if the man were no more than a foot away from him. "The way I see it, you got 2 options here," the voice continued. "Option number 1 is that you lie there on the ground until that thing's buddies come running due to the noise. How much ammo do you think your men have left? Option number 2 is that you screw your nuts back on, get up, and lead your men. There are a couple women over there, too," David replied to the voice in his head. "Speak only when I ask you a question, West Virginia," Brewster barked at him. "Now, as I was saying, your men and women over there are scared and confused. They don't know what the fuck that thing was any more than you do. But what you do know now is that it's not invincible, meaning its buddies probably aren't either. But you're gonna need some higher calibers, and a lot of them. So option number 2 is the only way you and your deputies have a chance of getting out of this alive. Or you're gonna lose our bet this late in the game. You can always have a nervous breakdown once this situation is seen to. Until then, you have a responsibility to those people who just saved your worthless ass." The voice went quiet again, leaving David alone with his thoughts. Why was he hearing Brewster again after all these years? And the bet. He'd forgotten all about their bet, even though Brewster was a permanent fixture in his memory. He had hated that man. Hated his drills, his insults, how hard he had pushed all of them. Hated him until the day he was shipping out. Brewster had approached him, looking like a goddamn recliner suddenly got the inclination to get up and walk. The sun had been shining, the late July weather scorchingly hot, and David's heart had sunk when he had seen the drill sergeant approach. "Now we find out if it was all worth it," Brewster had said, giving David a measured look. "You don't like me much, do you, West Virginia?" the sergeant had asked. David had kept quiet. "You can speak freely, Private," Brewster had offered. "No, sir, I don't," David had replied. Brewster had smiled at that, transforming his face into something that was almost friendly. "That's okay, West Virginia. To be honest, I don't like you much either. Big farm-bred Virginia boy, walking in here like you thought you was something. But you learned what real strength is during your time here, didn't you?" David had thought about that for a moment, and found that he had. "Yes, sir, I did," he had replied. "You gotta understand my position, West Virginia," Brewster had continued. "You see, we ran out of men, so now we're sending boys over there to fight this war. There are field sergeants over there no older than 21. I have to be hard on the lot of you, because I want you to survive. Whether I like you or not, you're a soldier in the United States military, and I want every one of you to come back alive and with all your limbs intact. If you think I was hard on you, the time you spent with me was nothing. The real hell is waiting for you on the other side of the ocean." Brewster had then given David an appraising look. "You got steel in you, West Virginia, but I still only give you a 50-50 chance of coming back. You gonna prove me wrong?" David had met the sergeant's eyes. "You're goddamn right I will," he had replied. "And I'll be the first person to buy you a beer," Brewster had said, smiling again. He had then given David a salute. "Be safe over there, Private Froman," he had said. In David's recollection, it was the first time Brewster had used his name. "And look after your brothers over there. They're your family. Not born by blood, but forged by trial. You be safe and come home, Private. That's an order." David had returned the salute, but kept quiet. He had not trusted his voice to stay steady in that moment. But he believed that he finally understood Brewster a little, and the sadness and fear in the sergeant's eyes told him the rest. Sheriff Froman rose to his feet, gave one last glance at the creature, which was lying still, although parts of its body continued to pulse and writhe, and then turned to his deputies. "Thank you," he said with a tip of the hat that he was not currently wearing. "Sheriff?" Hernandez asked, her voice quavering despite her obvious efforts to try and control it. "Sheriff, what the fuck was that thing?" "Not here," Froman answered. "We need to get back to the station, resupply on ammo, and I need to speak to that kid again. We need to get moving before the rest of them react to the gunfire."
"Rest of them?"
Deputy Pinkman asked.
"Jesus Christ, Sheriff. There's more of these things?"
"At least 126 more," David had answered. "How do you know?" Hernandez began, but then Froman could see the penny dropping within her eyes. He nodded. "The victims of whatever happened earlier," he confirmed, and then gestured back to the deformed lump of flesh. "I'm pretty sure that was one of them. I'll explain the rest when we get back to the station," David said as the sounds of screams and gunfire began from the surrounding areas. "We need to move if we want to protect the people, Hernandez," David finished. "And we need more guns and a hell of a lot more ammunition to do that. So let's get moving." 1:52 a.m. Michael sat within the darkness of the interrogation room, his only light coming from a Coleman lantern. The world narrowed to the chipped mug of lukewarm coffee trembling between his hands. The distant rattle of radios and the muted thud of boots filtered in from the hall, but inside the air was static with things unsaid. A deputy leaned against the doorframe outside, arms folded, looking in on Michael with the cool detachment of someone who had seen plenty of folks being left to ponder over their life choices. He raised the mug, let the bitter liquid touch against his tongue, and tried not to think about the blood on his shirt. The shadows at the far edge of the room thickened, as if the light itself were recoiling. Michael blinked once, twice, and almost spilled his coffee as the shape materialized. Tall, familiar, composed of memory and grief. Andrew stood before him, eyes too bright, his smile too gentle for a night like this. "You look awful," Andrew whispered, voice threading through the room like a draft. Michael set his mug down, knuckles white. "You're not here." Andrew crouched, his form flickering at the edges, and reached a hand across the scarred tabletop. "Does it matter?"
Listen, you know what you have to do.
Stop, Michael breathed, glancing at the deputy outside. But the man showed no sign of turning around, either oblivious or deciding that the kid on ice wasn't going anywhere. Andrew's gaze sharpened, the warmth fading.
The book, Michael. You gotta get it back. Finish what I started. All of this,
he gestured, encompassing the chaos beyond the walls. The screams that, unknown to Michael, were beginning to fill the world outside.
Gets worse.
Michael shook his head, heart pounding. But Andrew pressed on, insistent, his presence growing colder, more urgent with every word. Andrew leaned in, his voice a silvery thread binding the space between them.
You think you ruined it? You can still be forgiven, Michael. It wasn't your fault. Not all of it. You just didn't know any better. If you finish the ritual, if you bring the book back, they'll forgive you. I will too. There's a reward waiting for you at the end of this.
Michael's breath hitched, a dozen questions crowding the tip of his tongue. But Andrew's gaze pinned him in place. Shadows spilled from the corners, curling at Andrew's feet.
You're not alone, you know. Not really. Denise.
The name struck like a match in the darkness, and Michael's grip tightened on the mug.
She's alive. I saw her. She's trapped.
The library. She's still in there, lost in the dark. A tremor passed through Michael, hope and terror mingling. You're lying, he whispered. But Andrew only shook his head, the sorrow in his eyes folding into something darker.
Whatever you believe, go to the library. Go get the book. Finish what I started. If you do,
he added, softer now, almost gentle,
all of this will be over. People will still die. That's a foregone conclusion. But their end will be quick and relatively painless. Rather than, bloody and savage.
Michael's fingers trembled on the mug as he swallowed, forcing his gaze into Andrew's eyes. Those familiar, impossible eyes. You're not really here, he said, voice thin. And you're not Andrew. A strange calm flickered over Andrew's borrowed face. The edges of his form glimmered, unmoored from solidity, and he nodded, not denying, not defending.
You're right,
he said quietly.
I'm not. I'm what's left, Michael. The part of you that brushed against the book's heart. The memory it left behind. The fracture where truth leaks in.
Michael stared, terror unraveling into a cold, bleak clarity. Andrew's voice softened, echoing slightly now, as if the words came from inside Michael's skull.
You know the rules have changed, right? You know this world doesn't fit the old shape. I'm the piece of you that remembers that. The piece that can't look away from what I set in motion. I'm not here to haunt you, Michael. I'm here because some part of you still wants to finish it. Still wants to dive deeper into the truth.
He leaned closer, the illusion of warmth gone, replaced with a pallid shimmer.
You want the truth? You already have it. I'm just the echo reminding you. Go to the library. Get the book. There's still time, but not much. You don't need to believe me. Just go see for yourself.
For a moment, Michael's mind was a churning sea, and then beneath the surface a blunt certainty. What stood across from him was not a ghost, but the scar the book had burned into his own soul. Truth wearing Andrew's face. Michael recoiled, bracing himself against the brittle edge of the table, clinging to the fading solidity of his surroundings. "You're lying," he said again, more to himself than to the apparition before him, clutching the denial like a shield against the impossible. But the veneer of the interrogation room, with its institutional gray walls lit only by lamplight, began to ripple, the colors bleeding out, the walls warping as if reality itself were an old photograph left too long in the sun. Andrew's shape grew indistinct, the lines of his face unraveling, eyes becoming bottomless wells. The world shuddered. Michael's pulse thundered in his ears as the floor dissolved beneath him, tiles giving way to a horizonless void, geometry collapsing, right angles curving into spirals of ink and static. The room was gone. In its place, a landscape of shifting fragments, shattered bookshelves wheeling through starlit emptiness, words tumbling from open pages, each letter a living thing. Sounds twisted, stretching into silence, then breaking into a chorus of whispers. His name, Denise's, snatches of memories torn and rearranged. The Andrew thing hovered at the center, a focal point in this storm of chaos, flickering with the afterimage of a friend, now nothing but a vessel for Michael's guilt. Michael pushed himself backwards, his body weightless, his mind awash in dread and wonder. He reached for something solid, but his hands met only smoke and memory. The truth pressed in, overwhelming. All the boundaries he'd trusted had come unmoored, every rule rewritten in the wake of what had been unleashed.
"You see?"
The not Andrew intoned, voice layered with static.
"This is the shape beneath the surface. The world you remember is only the shadow. Here, in the heart of the fracture, there's nothing left to hide behind. Only the chaos that lies on the other side."
Michael clapped his hands over his mouth, desperate to cage the scream clawing its way up his throat. The symphony of chaos came to a crescendo, shrill and unrelenting, as if the world itself was tearing along hidden seams. He squeezed his eyes shut, just long enough for the torrent to crest, break, and recede. And then silence. The air was still cool and dense against his skin. Michael opened his eyes to find himself once more in the interrogation room, the lamplight steady, the table firm beneath his trembling fingers, the walls, flat, institutional, unmoving, held no trace of their earlier distortion. Across from him, the chair was empty. Andrew, whatever that presence had been, was gone. Yet something lingered, insistent and inescapable. The words pulsed in his mind, bright as afterimages. "Get the book." The echo of them was so clear he almost expected to see them hovering in the air, spectral yet undeniable. He lowered his hands, heart hammering, sweat cooling on his brow. Reality had returned, but it was thinner now, stretched taut over the memory of what he'd seen. The familiar room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. All that remained was the imperative, etched across the raw places in his mind. Get the book. 1:58 a.m. Deputy Frazier guided his cruiser along the narrow, dark ribbon of road that led out of Haven, headlights tunneling through the dense blackness left in the wake of the power outage. The familiar landscape, usually banal in its repetition, barbed wire leaning mailboxes, the hint of fields beyond, was rendered alien beneath the twin weights of silence and shadow. The world seemed to have shrunk to the space inside the vehicle. Engine purring, radio quiet, only the steady thump of his pulse for company. Sheriff Froman had asked him to head out of town while he was checking on the mortuary and something that Hernandez had reported. He was to contact the state police and request their aid during the current situation, even though it was clear that no one knew what that situation actually was. He drove with his window cracked, half hoping for a distant glimmer of light, any sign that the blackout hadn't swallowed the entire region. The air was cool, carrying the metallic tang of ozone and a faint underlying scent he couldn't quite name. Something resinous and sharp, like sap weeping from a wounded tree. The town limits marker flashed by, and Frazier pressed the accelerator, urgency mounting. State police would have backup generators, more manpower, and more help for the people of Haven. He rehearsed what he'd say when he reached them, how he'd explain the blackout, the missing people, the nervous edge in everyone's eyes. Then, as the cruiser rounded a gentle bend and the last of Haven faded behind him, his lights caught something impossible. The road simply ended, or rather it ran flush against a wall, vast, seamless, and looking almost alive. He braked hard, gravel skittering beneath the tires. The high beams washed over a surface that shimmered with a subtle pulsing motion, as if it breathed. The wall arced overhead, 40, maybe 50 feet high, although it was hard for him to tell in the near total darkness. What he could see was that it was blocking the road, the ditches, the fields beyond. It wasn't stone, not metal or wood, but something altogether other. Fibrous, ridged, the color of old wax and bruised fruit, slick with a faint sheen as though exuding a thin film of moisture. Aaron stepped out, leaving the engine running, his radio sitting within its cradle. The air outside vibrated with a hush so deep it pressed against his eardrums. He approached, boots crunching on the verge, hand instinctively dropping to the butt of his sidearm. Not that a weapon would matter against something like this. Up close the wall seemed to pulse, slow, tidal, as if answering to some heartbeat buried deep within the earth. Tendrils the width of his arm curled and retracted along its base, weaving in and out of the surface, leaving puckered scars behind. He extended a tentative hand, fingers outstretched, but before he could touch it, the barrier rippled, drawing back as though it had sensed his nearness. A low moan issued from within, the sound not quite organic, but almost mechanical. A resonance that seemed to speak directly to his bones. He staggered back, breath catching in his throat. The scent was stronger here, cloying and primal, shot through with the underlying mineral reek of something ancient and freshly unearthed. He called out, voice cracking, sound swallowed instantly by the wall's presence. There was no way around it. The barrier curved out of sight in both directions, disappearing into the tree line, as if the whole town had been wrapped in the stuff, sealed off from the world. On impulse, Aaron flung a rock at it. The stone struck and was absorbed with a wet, sucking sound, leaving only a faint ripple in the mass. He returned to his cruiser, hands shaking, mind reeling. Haven was isolated,
Not by the blackout, not by distance, but by this living wall. In the darkness, the only certainty was that nothing would be getting in or out of town tonight or any time soon. Through the windshield, Fraser's gaze cut the night in shards of trembling light. At first, he thought it was only the wind stirring the roadside brush, but the movement was too deliberate, too sinuous. Shadows flitted across the beams, slick bodies slithering in and out of the field of vision, quicksilver on the periphery. Some were low and serpentine, others skittered upright, limbs too many, and they were jointed all wrong. Their silhouettes suggested nothing Fraser could name, but their intent was clear. They were converging. A sharp crack splintered the hush, the unmistakable snap of distant gunfire, punctuated by shouts that rose and fell, muffled by the enclosing wall. Panic flared in Fraser's chest. He fumbled for the radio, hands slippery with sweat, and lifted the mic, thumb pressing the button so hard it hurt. 2:25 a.m. Inside the walls of the sheriff's department, the dispatch room glowed with the soft light of lanterns, casting frantic shadows. The battered dispatch console was strewn with half-drunk coffee cups, spilled reports, and a growing tangle of wires that seemed intent on strangling what little order remained. Sheriff Froman's voice was steady, measured, but his eyes darted between the pale faces of the deputies, betraying a deep unease. Hernandez, usually unflappable, drummed her fingers on the chipped tabletop, the rhythm sharp against the hush, and the others clustered close, drawn together like castaways on a sinking raft. The call from Fraser still echoed in the silence between their words. The town was sealed in by something no one could name or even comprehend. The world outside had been reduced to static, to the distant stutter of gunfire, to the threat of what slithered just beyond the reach of their meager lights. The memory of the sounds the creature at the hospital had made as it charged out of the basement, slick, wet, alive, and screams that were all too human clung to their thoughts, infecting every conversation with the possibility that every shadow held something watching. Froman recounted what Michael had told him in the trembling, halting way of someone afraid to look too closely at the truth. He whispered about the old book, its leather binding cracked and stained, its pages cramped with twisted script that sometimes seemed to shimmer or crawl when the young man had looked at it. He described the ritual in the library as Michael had told it to him. Of his friend Andrew's frantic breathing, the circle of alien blue light, the words that fell from his tongue in a guttural cadence, almost as if the language resisted being spoken aloud. He finished with how Michael had described Andrew being eaten alive by something unseen after he had knocked him out of the circle of light. How David had believed the kid was crazy until he went to the mortuary, and most definitely after the hospital. Hernandez ran a hand over her face, the lamplight drawing out the pallor beneath her skin, sweat beading on her narrowed brow. So this, well, whatever it is, it's tied to that ritual? Her voice fractured, barely more than a whisper, as if uttering it too loudly might draw something's attention. Froman nodded, voice thick with the weight of memory. He recalled the way Michael's hands had shaken, the way his eyes kept flicking to the door as though expecting something to surge through it at any moment. Michael said Andrew was trying to call something forth, something that I suppose lives just outside of our natural world.
But he interrupted the ritual before it was completed. He thought he had stopped it, but the words hung in the air, heavy as lead. He glanced at the window, where the dark pressed hard against the glass. The deputies exchanged glances, fear threading itself into the room and binding them together. The radio crackled, a sudden shrill burst that made everyone flinch, before dissolving into a thin filament of hope in the suffocating quiet. "Hello? Hello, is anyone there?" Hernandez's voice, laced with barely contained panic, was answered by static and the faint echo of someone praying. Inside, the only certainty was that whatever had been summoned, or awakened, was not done with Haven yet. Each heartbeat seemed to tighten the grip of the unseen presence, and the deputies waited, breathless, for any sign that their world had not yet completely collapsed into a nightmare. The door to the dispatch room opened, breaking the fragile quiet with the clatter of hurried footsteps and the faint scent of cheap perfume that clung to Holly's jacket. Her hair was disheveled, lips pressed thin, and the pale glow of the lamps turned her face spectral as she scanned the tense cluster of deputies. Her voice was soft, but carried the snap of urgency, slicing through the tension. "Sheriff, Michael, that kid, he's been asking for you," Holly announced, her eyes locking on David's. "He says it's important and that he won't talk to anyone else." Every conversation in the room withered. David's hand hesitated on the back of a chair, knuckles white. He felt the collective hope and dread in the air, as if Haven itself was holding its breath. "Where's he at?" David's voice was rough with exhaustion. "Still in the interrogation room. It didn't feel quite right putting him in a cell. He's been pacing for the last 20 minutes. Looks like he's talking to himself." David nodded, jaw clenched. He left the dispatch room, the door whispering shut behind him, the muffled radio static and anxious voices fading as he walked down the narrow, echoing hallway. Michael paced back and forth in the interrogation room, hands wringing together as if he could drive out the memory of what he'd seen this night. The lantern on the table cast restless shadows across his face. He looked up as David entered, his eyes wide and hollowed by fear and sleeplessness. "You said you wanted to see me," David prompted, pitching his tone as gentle as the moment allowed. "In truth, I was mean to talk to you all the same. I thought you were just crazy," Froman admitted. "But now I think different, so whatever you got to say, I'm all ears." Michael swallowed, glancing toward the blank gray wall as if making sure that it was still there. "Sheriff, I think I can undo what Andrew did." David stepped closer, boots scraping on tile. "How?" The question hung heavy, surrounded by the distant thud of gunfire as the situation beyond the department was escalating. Michael shook his head, voice trembling but determined. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. But I know I'll need the book. The one Andrew used. The one I buried. I need to see those words, the old language, to figure out what ritual he tried. If it's like a spell book, then there might be a way to reverse it, you know? A silence stretched between them, thick with dread and fragile hope. David watched Michael's hands, raw from worry, and saw in the young man's eyes a desperate, brittle resolve that echoed his own. "Well, as far as plans go, that one sounds pretty vague. But we'll get you the book," David said quietly, the words a vow heavy with the weight of unknown dangers. "You just tell me where you buried it, and we'll get it for you, whatever it takes." Michael opened his mouth determination flashing through the anxious lines of his face. "I should come. I can take you right to it. I can—" Froman raised a hand. The sheriff's authority settled over the cramped, lamp-lit room like a gathering thundercloud. "No," he said, his voice ironclad but not unkind. "You're a civilian, Michael. It's my job to keep you safe. We don't know what else might be out there. If things get heated—" He paused, letting the unsaid dangers linger in the air, sharp as broken glass. "You stay here. You've done enough for now. Just tell me where it's buried." Michael's protest hovered unspoken before he sagged, defeated, and nodded. He described the clearing behind the old mill road in painstaking detail, about half a mile from the library. The way the tree line curved away from the main path, the half-fallen birch tree with its pale bark flaking like old paint, its roots curling above the earth like the fingers of a buried hand. "I buried it just past that," Michael said, voice barely above a whisper. "Under the rocks by the creek bend. You'll see where the moss is torn up, fresh but already starting to grow back. There's a patch of bluebells just a little ways off. If you find those, you're close." Froman absorbed every word, mentally mapping the route through the tangled woods and muddy bank. The sheriff's eyes flickered to Michael's trembling hands, and he nodded a thank you to the young man. He left the interrogation room, the metallic click of the door echoing behind him. In the dispatch office, the air was dense with tension. Radios sputtering bursts of static and frantic code. Deputies engaged in quiet, nervous conversation. Froman's silhouette cut through the commotion like the brow of a ship. He called out the names of 8 deputies, people he trusted for their discipline and grit, their faces drawn but resolute. "We're going out," he announced, his voice low but carrying. "Full kit. Vests, flashlights, sidearms, shotguns, extra ammunition, and radios on an open channel. This isn't a routine call. You know that. We're retrieving something dangerous from the woods, and we do it by the book. No heroics." The deputies exchanged quick, loaded glances as they strapped on their gear. Holmes checking his sidearm, Hernandez loading extra batteries into her flashlight, Connor rubbing a thumb over the St. Christopher medal at his neck. They moved with the silent efficiency of a crew that knows the shape of fear, but not its flavor. Yet. As the team assembled, Froman flicked the switch on his radio and shared the coordinates Michael had described. "Clearing behind the old mill, half-fallen birch, rocks by the creek bend. Look for torn moss and bluebells. Eye up for anything out of place. We don't know what else might be out there." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and carrying distant echoes of unrest from the center of town. Froman stepped out into the restless night, Hernandez at his side, the heavy door swinging shut behind them. The air was thick and electric, charged with the threat of an oncoming storm, although the sky was still clear. Every sound was amplified. The brittle snap of twigs beneath their boots, the metallic click as Hernandez adjusted her vest, the distant clatter of shutters in the wind. They moved toward the waiting convoy of patrol vehicles, brown and white hulks crouched on the gravel, headlights off but radios blinking with eerie persistence. In the near distance, the deputies waited in a tense cluster, glancing often into the darkness. Froman raised a hand, halting Hernandez mid-step. His attention was caught by the horizon beyond the yard, where the world seemed subtly but unmistakably changed. The unfamiliar constellations over the treetops were broken, devoured by a new shadow. It was vast and seamless, a mass of darkness deeper than night itself, swelling over the pines like a tidal wave paused in the moment before collapse. Though the shape lacked any clear outline, no form that could clearly be perceived, its presence was unmistakably animate. The air around it shimmered, slightly warped, as though this darkness were not merely absence, but a living form pressing against the membrane of their world. Against the slightly off colors of the stars, they could see faint movement along its edges, ripples like breath, or the slow undulations of some enormous beast just beneath the surface. Froman's heartbeat thudded in his chest, every muscle tensed for a threat he could not name. Hernandez, pale beneath the rim of her cap, followed his gaze. Her grip on her flashlight had turned her knuckles bone white. She whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse, before raising her radio, but no words came. Behind them, the static of the dispatch office was suddenly drowned by a hush so deep it pressed against their ears. Every instinct screamed at Froman to look away, but he forced himself to study the thing. This anomaly, seeking any clue to its purpose or origin. It felt ancient, patient, a presence that did not belong, yet seemed inevitable. As the foreboding shadow shimmered out of existence, revealing the rest of the alien sky, David shared a quick glance with Hernandez. He steadied his voice for his team, projecting a calm he did not feel, as he was all but certain they had not seen the shadow.
"Stay sharp. We're not alone out there."
The words hung in the wind. Each carried a faint, impossible sound, like the distant rush of wings, or the murmur of something vast stirring just beyond the horizon, waiting to slip through. Quietly, he said to Hernandez,
"We need to find that fucking book. And fast."
As they headed down the stairs into the front of the line for David's cruiser, the alien sky looked down upon them with cold indifference. Thank you for joining us here at Nightmares Incorporated, and we hope to see you next time for part 3 of Beyond the Veil. Until then, sweet dreams.